Hi, everybody, and welcome to Something Funny Happened on the Way to the Discussion. My name is Lisa Clark. I'm a Senior Client Experience Manager here with Blackboard, and I am really thrilled to be welcoming Eric Hill for this discussion here with us today. Eric is a senior instructional designer at Daemen College with over 17 years of course design and development experience in secondary and higher education. He's held the position of instructional coordinator at Queens Grant High School. So he has that K through 12 experience, where he spearheaded a 2-year school-wide blended learning initiative prior to the COVID-19 pandemic. He's also a certified QM coordinator and serves as a member of the Quality and Online Education Committee and Innovative Academic Initiative Working Group at Daemen College. He holds a Master of Education in International Education from Framingham State University and a Master's Certificate in Instructional Systems Design from the University of North Carolina at Charlotte. A BS also in Secondary Education from Kutztown University in Pennsylvania. Eric's professional mission is to champion course design that is equitable, engaging, and flexible. So help me welcome Eric Hill.
Good morning, everyone, and thank you, Lisa, for such a great introduction. Something funny happened on the way to the discussion. Okay, that's the end of the presentation. No. So, like we all have been dealing with, we're trying to navigate this online and hybrid and digital world. And at Daemen College, as the COVID-19 pandemic began, we were really just starting to hit the ground running and starting to build a lot of our online programs. And like everyone else, the pandemic sort of thrust some things forward. So one of the things that we really had to take on with our course design and helping our faculty who had maybe not even had an online presence at all in the past was we had to help them with engagement strategies. We had to help them, really provide activities online where their students could still be involved in the class and they could build their teacher presence. So as we were doing this, and like everyone, as we were treading water really at the beginning and trying to get everybody sort of survive and get through the spring semester, discussions is something that came up quite often. And our objectives today, and in my objectives really in this presentation, is I'll sort of walk you through some ways in estimation of abilities with front-end preparation, the participation aspect of this certainly became a problem as well. And faculty definitely expressed that there were some students that were dominating conversation, other students were being very passive, and really just sort of laying back, and not a lot of actual conversation. It wasn't really a discussion. So responses and replies lacked some substance. Students came up with excuses. Of course, some were very legit, and of course, there was also grade complaints. Well, I met the parameters of your prompt. Why didn't I get this terrific grade that I was expecting to get? So as we continue to do our needs analysis, we come to our final sort of categorized issue of frustrations with discussions: facilitation, keeping the conversation going. Some faculty took it upon themselves to sort of interject on every comment, and the sheer volume alone was overwhelming. Managing one class was overwhelming, let alone the other, 4 or so classes that a lot of our faculty were working with. Procrastination, students waiting until the very last minute. A lot of this sometimes is tied to that front end planning. Are we allowing enough time for students to actually engage with the content, provide a proper prompt and things like that? Netiquette, which I'm sure we're all familiar with, that very simple idea of being polite in an online forum. And as we've seen from, I certainly won't get into people's political views, but as we've seen from around the country, it's very easy to sort of have some courage in an online forum that maybe in a face-to-face setting we wouldn't normally have, and that courage might be misplaced. And then conversation tangents, where the conversation just goes completely away from the prompt. So what we began working with faculty on was an effective, but yes, very typical discussion design. And what I'm about to demonstrate, I'm sure we've all done. We've all done this in our courses. We've all seen this. If you've ever taken an online course, I would say within the last 5 years or so, you've probably had this kind of prompt set up for yourself as well. So as you can see on the title, we did everything right, right? Well, I promise we're getting to the funny part. The first thing we started working with faculty on was establishing conditions. That there has to be that front end planning, that you need to have time to first post and make that discussion available for students, allow a proper amount of time for them to submit an initial post, and then also make sure there's a proper amount of time for replies to classmates if you're actually trying to have a conversation. So we highly encouraged our faculty, have your discussion available on a Monday, give them a few days to do the research, the reading, whatever it is that they need to do, and by Thursday is when their initial post should be, replied to. Some sort of standard along those lines. Again, we've probably all seen this. Making sure we put in there that they should cite evidence. We worked with faculty, we ran workshops on Bloom's taxonomy and developing our questions using Bloom's taxonomy question starters, which, by the way, before I forget, when you get access to this presentation, you notice there are a lot of hyperlinks spread throughout this presentation. You'll have access to all these things that we've certainly presented and had workshops on with our faculty. And since, of course, quality matters, QM is a big thing at our institution, we worked with faculty on aligning your question prompts to your course objectives. So far, we're feeling really good about this. Faculty are sort of using this as a template. They're establishing their conditions and setting up their time constraints. They're restating their learning objectives in their question prompts. So there's our little recap there. The conditions for the initial post and the replies are ready to go. What you don't see pictured, we're also working with our faculty on. And again, I'm telling a story from about last spring. We communicated with faculty that they have to have a rubric that goes along with this, right? Let's address those grade complaints. So we're hitting on these issues that came in from this needs analysis. We are encouraging faculty to provide a model example, right? Maybe you should be the first one to post, at least in the first discussion. Be the first one to post, demonstrate what it should look like, or possibly bring great responses from students from previous sections. Of course, eliminate their name, post that in there as a great response. Model what students should be doing. We worked with faculty on using student facilitators, hoping that the conversation would keep going, that the students themselves could sort of lead the discussion, having group leaders, whether it be in groups or just one student sort of leading the discussion, holding those students accountable, and then finally wrapping it up with some sort of debrief, some sort of summary, right? Let's bring it all together. What should we have gotten out of this discussion? And we did everything right, right? So something funny happened. Ha, ha, ha. Even though the title here says the overlooked element, it was overlooked, but it really wasn't overlooked. It was that engagement piece. The students, as we followed up and we wrapped up our spring semester last year, we really tried over last summer, the summer of 2020, to really now just sort of get good at that classic but typical discussion post sort of setup. And our faculty did embrace it. They certainly did look at it as a way to say, hey, we can do this and we can hold students accountable, and I'm getting more replies. And faculty reported they were getting more replies more consistently. Students were chiming in, but what they noticed was it still wasn't really a conversation. That online discussion forum was really just replying to prompts and sort of replying to a classmate. And usually, if Eric Hill was replying to Lisa Clark, Eric Hill almost always replied to Lisa Clark. So we conducted another needs analysis over the summer, toward the end of last summer, excuse me, and going throughout the fall this year. And what our students reported, what our faculty reported, was we needed some ways, some techniques to really capture student interest, capitalize on their curiosities, really allow this conversation to be more conversational. The issues that came up, well, we sort of reaped what we sowed. We did such a good job out of our office and the Office of Instructional Design on sort of setting up and advertising that template for discussions that it became very repetitive and systematic, sort of in all online courses and in most hybrid courses throughout the college. Students were basically doing the same thing again and again. And what we also saw was they were asked to do the same things even at the beginning of a course where they might have introductions. They were just, it was very repetitive. There wasn't really any incentive for creativity. Students themselves there was incentive to, of course, submit on time and to reply to a classmate, but there wasn't incentive to challenge boundaries, at least in an appropriate way. There wasn't any incentive to say, hey, I have a unique idea here and I want to express it, but if I do that, I don't know that really exists in the rubric. Maybe I'll lose points. So in our needs analysis, we captured a lot of that, and we wanted to try to now, in our next stage here of evolution, if you will, make sure that we were trying to allow students to be creative and express their curiosity. As I mentioned, no incentive to go beyond the requirements of the prompt itself, and fresh ideas were rarely exchanged. Luckily, one of the elements that wasn't too big of a deal, we did work with many of our faculty on sort of expressing to the students on the front end, being very transparent that just liking a comment wasn't going to be good enough, that there needed to be some replies with some substance. So as our faculty embraced some rubrics and things like that we had shared out, at least the I like what you had to say didn't get reported as being the biggest issue. So after our next needs analysis, a funny thing happened on the way to our next step here in our discussions, some solutions and resources. Not only did we research, but we attended many workshops ourselves out of our office about looking at some ways to refresh both the discussion board, but also one of the really sort of surprising elements that was reported back to us that was also just repetitive and sort of like, man, I wish we could do something different. The learner introductions as well. So I'm going to steal from the keynote speaker earlier. We definitely stole where we could, right? We copy and stole everything that we could, and we made it fit into what works for us at Daemen College. And I'm going to actually start with talking about a few examples from the Learner Introductions refresh. So in our Learner Introductions refresh, you can see the list on the left there. We, of course, provided an example of the classic, right? And I'll skip through our list just a little bit, and I have some examples to go through. But we have our classic setup, post something about yourself, tell us who you are, and it might look something like the top one here. We provide this document to our faculty so they get a quick description of what the the strategy is, the classic learner introduction strategy. In this case, post response to the prompt, post response to classmates. And then we sort of practice what we're preaching with faculty. Let's also provide an example on what that might look like. So in this document, again, in our classic, we hit on what everyone was doing anyways, but then we started saying, well, what about that student curiosity? What about something fresh? And we have examples of things like pet's perspective. This is definitely one of my favorites. It's one in which students can sort of introduce themselves as though they are their pet. So I have a dog. His name is Guinness, and the reason his name is Guinness, and this is probably this, excuse me, this would be something I modeled with faculty. The reason my dog's name is Guinness, right? I would take on that first person perspective. Hi, I'm Guinness. My owner wanted to name me Bacon, but my coloring is such dark brown, and Nikki, my other owner, she really thought that I looked more like Guinness beer. Hence, this is how I got my name. And of course, it could go from there. So the pet's perspective is something that a few faculty have certainly embraced as they especially show off their pets. It's allowed that teacher presence to build up. It's been real funny in that sense where that's actually helped build a little bit more of a sense of community in courses. Instructors' tone is another strategy here. I won't dive too deeply into that one. This is just a screenshot of the document, but I know you'll have access to this afterwards, and perhaps Lisa or our producer is maybe sharing out the hyperlink now. But probably one of my favorite is on the second page of this document when you have access to it. It's called "Let's Play a Game." And how often do you really get to play a game, sort of like you would do in class? And it's a very simple premise. It's the idea that we're going to set the stage for an adventure. And what's going to happen is we can use it to either teach a concept or to introduce our syllabus, things like that. So that's certainly one aspect of trying to not only increase our teacher presence, address student curiosity, and hopefully really get them engaged in discussion. Another piece of this, especially when we come to the discussion board refresh, is that while we provided resources to faculty like those Bloom's taxonomy question starters or Socratic questioning techniques, a lot of our faculty, because of that volume, we go back to that original issue, because of our volume of intake of questions, they still couldn't keep up with it. And they were expecting students to ask really thought-provoking, deep questions that unfortunately, when students ran their own groups or perhaps where they were the facilitator for an entire discussion in a course, a lot of times they fell a little flat. And really, we couldn't blame students for that. They probably haven't led a discussion before, at least not onto this kind of level, probing for this kind of depth. So any of these discussion board refresh situations that, again, I'll demonstrate one or two here in a moment, they were also, we encourage our faculty, send along that Socratic questioning technique to your group facilitators. It's not state secrets or anything. The CIA is not involved. We don't have to worry about that. It's okay to share it with them. If they're facilitating these discussions, encourage them how, first of all, to use it, and then second of all, maybe have a follow-up Zoom meeting, show them how to use it, walk them through some of the steps, model the examples. We did not want to forget those things that at least really set us off on a right path, on a good path. So we constantly referenced back to a lot of those things that our students were were already doing last spring and throughout the summer and throughout really the fall of 2020 as well. And to hit on a couple of these discussion board refresh examples, of course, we have our classic. We've already spoken about that, so I won't rehash that one. But reflections was certainly one that a lot of our faculty really they didn't look at reflections as a piece of something that they used quite often. Um, so that was our next stepping point. It may not seem the flashiest or the most engaging, but it really, for a student, it was very introspective. And we got a lot of great feedback from faculty and students that had to start using that reflection piece. And what we started to notice, especially with questions like, what benefited you most from working on this module? What challenged you the most from working on this? Describe a scenario in which you'll actually apply this information. Probably one of the biggest positive pieces of feedback we got from students was that they were finally asked, how are you going to use this information in real life? That's a very cliched thing we've all heard, I'm sure, right? How am I going to use this in real life? Where is this going to apply? In a previous life, Lisa alluded to, I've been in education for over 17 years. In a previous life, I used to be a history teacher as well. And of course, teaching history, I never taught the Pythagorean theorem. That was for our math instructors. But I very vividly remember a student one day coming to class, sort of complaining, I'm never going to use Pythagorean theorem in life. What am I using this for? And I stopped the student at the door and I said, you know what? Actually, believe it or not, I use it. And they sort of looked at me with a side eye and said, Mr. Hill, how? I said, well, I don't typically use it at work as a teacher here in my job, but I use it at home. I do some things to renovate my own home. And if I want a square wall, a 3-4-5 triangle, which any math teacher could tell you, right, gives you a right angle, I'll know that whatever I'm creating is now square. I pull 3 feet, 4 feet, 5 feet in my right angled triangle, and I've got a square perpendicular wall to the wall that's there, or whatever. And you could sort of see that moment click for the student. What our faculty reported from these reflections and our students reported is not only did they have more aha moments, but because they got to see what some of their peers were thinking as they were posting to these, they got to see that they weren't alone. They got to express more curiosities. It actually did in itself encourage more curiosity. The fishbowl technique is one that we also very much like. It's it's a refresh on the idea of sort of putting someone in center stage, right? Now, in our example here, the description, you can see it says one group of students post a response to the prompt. The rest of the class replies to just the initial post. The group offers rebuttals. So it's sort of a one group versus everyone in their scenario. What some of our faculty have done, and this is great, right? They take it and they make it their own and they spin it off in their own way. Some of our faculty have said, I'll be the one to post the initial response. It'll be me versus the students. And what's nice about this engagement strategy sort of almost made it competitive. And we've had some faculty that have even given a little bit extra credit if a student has stumped them. If a student has either asked a question where they said, you know, I actually need to research that. That's a great question. And I'm, well versed in most of it, but I want to give you the best response possible. And so that alone, certainly encouraged almost the competitive juices. And again, since we're in an online forum, students very much had not all of them, of course, but some of them had a little more courage to be able to reach out and say, I'm going to engage in this conversation. Again, Socratic questioning techniques shared with students, and they could use them in their questioning of the instructor. Or even if it's not questioning only the challenge, but just asking for more clarification, it became more of a conversation. And our faculty really embraced using more than just one kind of discussion strategy. One of my favorites, as I mentioned, again, you'll have access to this on the document for discussion board refresh, is as a former history teacher, alternate history / alternate perspective. I used to always challenge my students when we would have debates in class that it wasn't good enough only to prepare their argument for their side of an issue, whatever the issue might be, a political issue, voting rights, whatever. It didn't matter. I don't want you only to prepare for your side. I want you to prepare for the other side. And as I've worked with faculty on this, faculty, of course, they sort of understand that right away where I'm going. But students, I love that transparency. Again, back to our keynote speaker, he alluded to this, that students really need to be part, right? That community part that he spoke about. They need to be part of the process. This is one way to make them part of the process. That why that explanation as to why you have to do both sides. It's not because I said so. It's because if you can prepare for the other side of the argument, you can make a stronger argument for what you're already preparing. And as I've worked with faculty, they've really loved this idea well, especially in the liberal arts. So you've got other examples of things like alternate history, student showcased, of course, debates in the news for our current events people, challenge questions, critiques, lots of examples. And then something funny continued to happen. We still had some faculty and some students reporting that, yes, while these are no longer stale, while there's a nice mixture. I've got some instructors that are doing some different things. They're making it their own. We needed to update our rubrics. We still had a lot of make sure you reply to 2 classmates, and then a lot of students just sort of ended it there. Now, luckily, we saw improvement. We did have students that were doing more than before, but what we really wanted to encourage was, as I mentioned earlier, that curiosity. We really wanted to encourage that discussion to continue and to keep going, and that it could even continue beyond the due dates if needed. So I do have a hyperlink here for some of our rubric examples, our discussion posts, our classic critical thinking rubrics, other things. But what I want to skip to is one criterion that's actually now built into some of our rubrics. It helps. It doesn't solve the issue. This is an ever-evolving issue, but it does help. This replies to classmates section. In the past, this would have looked like reply to one classmate and then it'd be spelled out. But what we thought would be helpful would basically encourage to earn the most points, right? Obviously, we want to make this worth it. We're not going to say something like reply to at least 2. What if we just slightly change the wording to reply to more than 2? And we're being intentionally vague there. 2 is going to fall just a little bit short. If you think about the wording, right, in our second criterion there, more than 1 posted replies, more than 1 would imply 2, but you could do 3 or 4. In our first set of criterion, the one that would get you the most points out of this replies to classmates, more than 2 posted replies to more than 2 classmates. We don't want you just to reply to the same classmate 3, 4, or 7 times. At least that idea of still at least 2 students being in there exists, and the idea of go beyond just the 2. And some of the reports that we've gotten back from faculty about this is they are noticing that, okay, I am having more students that are still, or I'm sorry, that aren't still, excuse me, that are replying to more than 2 classmates. They're choosing to reply to 3 or 4 things that as they scroll through them, they're realizing there's commonality or there's challenges that they want to make. But they're also not picking just one classmate and replying to them 2 or 3 times. And they're not necessarily as often replying to just the same 3 with more replies. It's starting to, in a good way, in some of our courses, embolden students to really reach out and go through these and carry on the conversation. Now, what's interwoven throughout the rest of each of these criterion is now the substance of these replies. It's not just the quantity, reply to more than 2 and more than 2 classmates, but it's also now the substance built into it. I could certainly reply to 3 or 4, and that second really in the middle column there, that second criterion, reply to more than one posted replies to more than one classmate. I could reply to 3 or 4, but that's ultimately where my grade lies, because that goes on to explain how the substance isn't quite to the highest level that faculty might be looking for. So what we really sort of wrapped things up with our faculty, we do have our own Office of Instructional Design website. We have definitely stolen terrific things out there from other universities, from papers that have been written. We make sure that these resources are available to our faculty, so they can not only attend our workshops, we can walk through the PETS perspective, we can walk through discussion posts about alternate history, and really conduct workshops that help them. But we also, it was funny, found our faculty were even yearning for more. As more and more of our faculty have sort of embraced the oh, I can keep my discussion post as a category, but I can use different kinds of discussion posts and really pick and choose what needs. They were yearning for more. We even encourage our faculty, if these resources work, share some of these resources with your students. It's as simple as sending out that hyperlink. If it helps them be better facilitators of conversations, if that's a route you're going, certainly share it with your students. I hope you found this presentation helpful today. My name is Eric Hill, Senior Instructional Designer at Daemen College. You're welcome to email me. I'm going to turn it back over to Lisa now, see if we have any questions that hopefully I can help with.
Hey, Eric, we do have some questions. So thank you
Terrific.
first and foremost. A great presentation.
Thank you.
So just touching back on the kind of one of the last points you were making, Catherine asked, when you did the refresh, did you keep the due dates of Thursday for the initial post and Sunday for response posts?
Great question. We definitely left that up to faculty to decide how they would do that. Most of our faculty did keep that. They liked the consistency. They liked that it worked with their syllabus, and it allowed the students to sort of have a pattern with which to follow. So most, I would say, just anecdotally speaking, of our faculty kept that pattern. Other faculty, it depended which strategy that they embraced. Some kept it as an open for several weeks type of discussion. So, for example, even though this was a learner introduction, the pet's perspective. So I had a faculty member reach out to me and she said, "Well, I have a student that's never had a pet before. They reached out to me via email and said, I just got a pet, but I don't know my pet well enough to take on my pet's personality yet." And so the faculty, I give kudos to this faculty member. Faculty member said, this doesn't have to be due this week. This is an introduction. How long does it take to get to know someone? You don't get to know someone in the first week of class. So she said, I'm going to make it available on, and I believe it was still that Monday, that first Monday of the course. And she kept it open for the entire month. And she was happy but yet disappointed. She said it was the most engaged discussion I had that entire month, because students loved pets. There were goldfish, there were dogs, there were parrots, there were cats, there were people that live in rural areas that said, I have cows, so I took on the personality of one of my cows. It was all over the board, and she said it was the most engaged. They kept the discussion going. I only chimed in really for entertainment's sake. But wow, in that first month, we really built a sense of community. We really got to know each other, all through a commonality of pets. And students that still didn't have a pet, she was flexible. She worked with them to say, take on the personality of a pet you would like to have. So that was, again, I have to give kudos to that faculty member.
Awesome. Thank you for that. So another question that came from our group, what kind of tasks were set for the discussions?
Tasks for the discussions usually were set around, obviously, the content. So I'll go back to alternate history, not only from my own experience, but working with some history faculty members. There was they're studying civil rights of the 1950s and 60s, and they decided, instead of alternate perspective, they were going to take on alternate history type of thing. So the prompt was certainly centered around the idea that, what if Rosa Parks hadn't refused to move on the bus. And it was great because what this faculty member had woven in was, I'm actually going to provide a list of about 4 or 5 what ifs of said in the civil rights movement. And you as a student get to choose one of those. I'm not going to dictate to you it has to be only about Rosa Parks. Another example was, what if Eisenhower didn't send in the National Guard to escort the Little Rock Nine to their classes back in 1957? And so students really they were actually touching another funny aspect of this, right? And this funny thing happened on the way to the discussion. Students really took ownership it spoke to their curiosity. They took ownership of what they had, and it encouraged, I'm sure we've all heard this phrase, voice and choice, right? In this case, they didn't have 100% choice, but they definitely had 100% voice.
Mm-hmm.
These are my options. These are what I can choose. And this one speaks to me the most, and that'll be where my voice comes in.
Awesome. And then were the discussion tasks authentic and related to the real world? It sounds like they probably were, right?
Great question. We definitely worked with faculty on that as well. Where we found, and again, this is just anecdotally speaking, where we found the most authentic discussions have taken place have been in courses that might require a little more performance, so to speak. So our PT courses, our physical therapy courses, for example, the discussion centered around the describe how to wrap an ankle type of situation. And some faculty, especially as things were locked down and students were not on campus, not having the ability to wrap an ankle on a dummy in the PT department in the classroom, the faculty were great. Well, how can I get my students to demonstrate this? And we talked about, what if they recorded? What if they had their brother or sister or someone in the home use their phone, record them wrapping dad's ankle? Dad can just pretend to have a sprained ankle, and they can post that. Now, what's the discussion that centers around that? Right. So I hope everybody can see the authenticity there, right? If you're a physical therapist, you're probably going to have to wrap an ankle at some point, or thousands of ankles, I would imagine. The conversation was simply around what issues did you have, working with a patient who, a real world scenario, who maybe the issue isn't really as bad as they think it is. So it went into like ethical and hypothetical situations. Students asked those questions of each other. They responded, well, my dad did this, my dad did that. And some of them were silly, but some of them, they also said, well, I recalled what we spoke about with a bedside manner and how you can work with patients. And the conversations, this was a good tangent to sort of go off on for this faculty member. Conversations seemed very authentic about the how to deal with. It wasn't just how do you wrap, but now how do you deal with the patient at the same time.
Right.
So I hope that answers that question.
Yeah, no, that was great. And then I'm going to combine a couple of questions because I think we have one more left here. But do you have any pointers for discussions for both medium-sized classes, about 60 or so in a class, without any support TAs or anybody? And then also for the opposite end of that, like 5 and less in a class?
So my suggestion for the 60 plus, the larger classes, I would even say, to be honest, I would even say 20 plus, is definitely leverage your student leaders. So in that first month or so of class, as you're getting your learner introductions, and I'm sure you're posting some content oriented discussion prompts as well. Start easy for yourself, start easy for students. Identify who those student leaders are and leverage them. Give them those Socratic questions that, even if you're not running these in groups, and I probably would recommend groups as well, small groups of 5 to 6, give or take. But if you're not leveraging them, use those student leaders to actually continue to drive the discussion. Have them probing for more depth, looking for clarification on posts and things. And one of the ways in which we've worked with faculty on balancing that is, if they're, let's say in a class of 60, you have 6 student leaders who can do this. You've got about 10 per, if you're just looking at it in that sense. You can have a pre-discussion meeting with that student leadership and walk them through, Eric Hill, you have last name alphabet A through G, and so on and so forth. Hopefully a nice even split, right?
Mhm.
Work with them. They maybe have not done this before. So have a pre-event type of meeting with them on how to run these discussions. In a small class, so the opposite of that, a class of 5, most of our faculty, and including myself when I taught, I like to sort of be the facilitator of those on my own, and I always played the devil's advocate. I think the devil's advocate role for an instructor it can be a great route to take. It's certainly meant to have them problem solve and have them critically think, right? Now, you definitely could rotate that through, and just one of them is the student leader, and you're there to maintain civility and things like that. But all these strategies, to sort of summarize a lot of this together real quick, all of these strategies can work in either a synchronous or an asynchronous environment,
Okay.
a hybrid or a fully online environment. So don't be afraid to tweak these strategies to suit your needs. It's not a one size fit all. It's definitely not a paint by numbers scenario. It's a start. And practice with your students, practice with yourself. It's okay to make mistakes. I guess those would be sort of my tips there.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Eric. We are at our limit here for our time today in this particular session. Great comments and questions in the chat. So thank you all. And I apologize for any that we didn't get to today, but let's continue the conversation in community. So please join community.blackboard.com if you haven't already. We can continue these conversations there. And perhaps Eric can even chime in there and answer some more questions for you. So please do go back to your agenda and get to your next session. Thank you all very much, and we'll see you next time.